Lovecraft's gods and creatures are almost impossible to see because just by looking at them, you already go insane. However, a man insisted on visiting a place where one of these creatures or gods was imprisoned. Some say he was the most powerful of all. He spoke to him, and, moreover, he even became one of his creatures. I'm going to tell you this whole story today. And since this kind of video is a lot of work, I'm going to ask you to share it, leave your like, and subscribe to the channel because it helps me a lot, you know? Stay tuned for one of my favorite Lovecraft stories, Through the Gates of the Silver Key. In a vast room with walls adorned with tapestries of strange figures and the floor covered with Bokhara rugs of extraordinary craftsmanship and incredible antiquity, 4 men were seated around a table cluttered with documents. From distant corners where strange wrought iron tripods were occasionally refueled by a very elderly gentleman, and a somber livery emanated hypnotic scents of olibanum, while in a deep niche, on one side, a strange coffin-shaped clock ticked rhythmically. Its dial was adorned with disconcerting hieroglyphs, and its 4 hands did not move in accordance with any system of time known on this planet. It was a singular and disturbing room, but well suited for the business at hand. For there, in the house in New Orleans of the greatest mystical mathematician and Orientalist on this continent, the distribution of the inheritance of a mystic, scholar, author, and dreamer was finally being settled. No less important was the fact that 4 years earlier, Randolph Carter, who had spent his whole life trying to escape the boredom and limitations of reality, had vanished from the face of the earth. He awakens, evoking dreamlike landscapes and legendary avenues from other dimensions. He disappeared from the world of men on October 7, 1928, at the age of 54. His career was strange and solitary, and there were those who assumed, because of his extravagant novels, that there must have been episodes much more bizarre than what was known about him. His association with Harler Warren, the mystic from South Carolina, whose studies of the primitive Nakal language of the Himalayan priests had led to such hideous consequences, was close. In fact, it was he who, on a terrible and maddening night in an ancient cemetery, saw Warren descend into a damp and nitrous crypt, never to emerge again. Carter lived in Boston, but all his ancestors came from that mountainous and rugged region behind the ancient city of Arkham, full of legends and cursed by witches. And it was among those ancient and mysterious hills that he finally disappeared. Parquet, his former servant, died in early 1930. He described a strangely aromatic carved box with hideous ornaments he found in the attic, along with indecipherable scrolls and a silver key engraved with rare designs that this box contained. Matters about which Carter had also written to other Carters. He said he told him that this key had come from his ancestors and that it would help him unlock the gate to his lost childhood, and of strange dimensions and fantastic regions he had only seen before in vague, fleeting dreams. Then one day, Carter took the box and its contents and left in his car, never to return. Later, people found the car by the side of an old grassy road in the hills, behind the desolate town of Arkham, the hills where Carter's ancestors once lived, and whose dilapidated cellar of what was once a grand residence was all that remained open to the sky. It was in a grove of tall elms nearby that Udo Carter had mysteriously disappeared in 1781. And not far away was the half-rotten cabin of Godey Fowler, the witch, where she brewed her abominable potions. Some time ago, the region had been settled in 1692 by fugitives from the Salem witch trials, and even today it still has a reputation for harboring sinister and vaguely ominous things that could hardly be imagined. Edmund Carter managed to escape just in time from the ruins of Golo Hill, where its citizens wanted to take him, but even so, there were still many rumors, spells, and witchcraft. And now, apparently, his only descendant had come to meet him. In the car, they found a chest with those grotesque carvings etched into that fragrant wood, just like the scroll that no one could decipher. The silver key was gone. Most likely, Carter had taken it with him. Besides, there were no references in the case. Boston detectives said that the fallen timbers from Carter's old house showed a certain disorder, and someone had found a handkerchief on the rocky, eerily wooded slope behind the ruins of the dreaded cave called Snake Den. It was then that the legends circulating in the region about the Snake Den gained new vitality. The peasants once again began to speak in hushed tones about the unholy practices to which old Edmund Carter, the warlock, had devoted himself in that dreadful cave, and they added later stories about the fondness that Randolph Carter himself had for it when he was a boy. During Carter's childhood, the old wooden-roofed mansion still stood, occupied by his great-uncle, Christopher. He visited it often and spoke in a peculiar way about the Snake Cave. People remembered what he had said about a deep fissure and an unknown inner cave inside the Snake Cave, and they speculated about the change he had shown after spending an unforgettable day in the cave when he was 9 years old that had happened in October, and since then, he seemed to have an incredible talent for prophesying future events. On the night Carter disappeared, it rained until late, so no one could find the slightest trace of the steps he might have taken after leaving the car. Inside the Serpent's Den, everything was liquid, shapeless mud due to the abundant seepage. Only the rustic ignored it, while the ignorant whispered about supposed footprints, where the large omos hung from the road, and on the sinister slope near the Serpent's Den where the handkerchief was found. Who would listen to these rumors? According to which these footprints were identical to those left by the square-toed boots that Randolph Carter was said to have worn as a child. That story was just as foolish as the one where they claimed to have seen the unmistakable footprints of Benja Corey's boots meeting the small, short tracks on the road. Old Benja was hired by the Carters when Randolph was young, but he would die 30 years earlier. It was likely those comments and Carter's statement to Parks and others that the dish key oddly was missing. It would help him unlock the gate to his lost childhood. This led several mystical students to declare that the missing man had actually turned back the trail of time and went back 45 years to that other October day in 1883 when he had stayed in the Serpent's Den as a boy. When he left that night, they argued, he had somehow made the entire journey back to 1928, especially since he wouldn't know about the things that happened later. And yet, he had never talked about anything that would happen after 1928. One of these wise men, an eccentric old man from Providence, Rhode Island, who had maintained a long, close correspondence with Carter, had an even more elaborate theory, and he believed that Carter had not only returned to childhood, but had achieved an even greater degree of release, now able to wander through the primal landscapes of his childhood dreams. After having a strange vision, this man published an account of Carter's disappearance in which he hinted that the lost one now occupied a throne of opal in Illiquid, that fabulous city of glass on top of the Otis Cliff, overlooking the Crespolar Sea, where the bearded and slender Nor-finned creatures build their unique labyrinths. It was this old Ward Phillips who argued vehemently about the distribution of Carter's assets to his heirs, all distant cousins, claiming that he was still alive. He's in another temporal dimension and could return someday. Against him was pitted the legal talent of one of the cousins, Ernest Bean Anspiel from Chicago, the man who was 10 years older than Carter, but as enthusiastic as a young man when engaged in legal battles. For 4 years, the dispute had unfolded, but now it was time for the division, and that vast, strange room in New Orleans would be the setting for the agreement. The house belonged to Carter's executor for literary and financial matters, the distinguished scholar of mysteries and Oriental antiquities, Etienne Laurent Marigny. Carter met Marigny during the war when they both served in the French Foreign Legion. He was immediately drawn to him because of their similar tastes and opinions. When, during a memorable joint leave, the young scholar took the Boston dreamer to Brionne in southern France, He showed him certain terrible secrets. In the nocturnal and ancient crypts buried beneath that dark and heavy city, their friendship was sealed forever. Carter's will had named Marini as executor, and now that experienced scholar was reluctantly presiding over the settlement of the estate. It was a sad task for him because, as an old Rhode Islander, he did not believe that Carter was dead. But how do mystics' dreams compare to the world's Harji wisdom? Around the table in that strange room in the old French Quarter sat the men who claimed to have an interest in the case. There had been the usual legal conference luncheons reported in the newspapers, wherever Carter's heirs happened to be. But only 4 were now seated, listening to the abnormal ticking of that coffin-shaped clock, which did not keep earthly time, and the bubbling of the courtyard fountain, clear as crystal there, through half-closed windows. As the hours passed, the faces of the 4 became half-shrouded in the swirling smoke from the tripods, which were carelessly piled with fuel. They needed less of the old man's attention, who hovered silently and grew increasingly nervous. Present was Etienne Marigny, a slim, dark, elegant man with a large mustache and youthful look. Aspinwall, the heir's representative, had white hair, an apoplectic face, was chubby, and had huge sideburns. Phillips, the mystic from Providence, was thin, gray-haired, long-nosed, clean-shaven, and had sloping shoulders. The 4th man was of indeterminate age, with a thin, dark, bearded face, absolutely impassive, wearing a turban that indicated his high Brahmin caste. His eyes were as black as night, full of fire, almost without irises, and it seemed as if he was looking from a distant abyss behind his eyes. He introduced himself as Swami Chandraputra, an adept from Benares, with some extremely important information. And both Marigny and Phillips, who corresponded with him, were quick to recognize the authenticity of his mystical claims. His speech had a strangely forced, hollow, metallic tone, as if speaking English strained his vocal cords. However, his language was as fluent, correct, and natural as that of any native Anglo-Saxon. Overall, he was a normal European civilian, but his loose clothes hung on him in a peculiar way, while his thick black beard, oriental turban, and large white gloves gave him a very eccentric look. De Marigny, fiddling with the parchment found in Carter's car, spoke up. He couldn't decipher a single letter of that parchment. Mr. Phillips here also gave up. Colonel Cushward states that it's not in cuneiform and doesn't look anything like those hieroglyphs found in that wooden city on Easter Island. The closest thing I can remember to these characters on the parchment is how all the letters seem to hang from horizontal word bars. It's a script very similar to the one in the book that poor Harlow Warren once had. It seems it came from India. Well, when Carter and I were visiting him in 1919 and he never told us anything about it. He said it would be better if we didn't know, and hinted that it might have originally come from somewhere other than Earth. He took it with him in December when he went down to the crypt of that old cemetery, but neither he nor the book ever came back to the surface. Some time ago I sent to our friend, who is Swami Chandraputra, a brief outline of the memory of some of those letters, and also a photostatic copy of Carter's scroll. He believes he can clarify them after some investigation and inquiry. As for the key, Carter sent me a photo. Its strange arabesques weren't letters, but appeared related to the same cultural tradition as the parchment's hieroglyphs. Carter always said he was about to solve this mystery, although he never gave any details. Once he even almost became a poet with all this business. That ancient silver key, he said, would open the successive doors that bar our free passage through the mighty corridors of space and time, even the boundary none have crossed since Shaddai, who used his genius to build and hide in Arabia's sands. In the vast domed city of 1,000 pillars, holy to the hungry, Carter wrote, and maddened nomads returned to tell about that monumental gateway and about the hand carved above the angular pillar of the arch. But no man has crossed it and returned to say that his footprints in the inner sands attest to his visit. The key, he supposed, was precisely the one the Cyclopean hand was trying, in vain, to grasp. We can't say why Carter didn't take the scroll, just as he didn't take the key. Maybe he forgot, or maybe he even refrained from bringing up the memory that his friend had taken a book with similar characters to the crypt and never came back. Or maybe it was really irrelevant to what he wanted to do. When Marini paused, Senior Phillips began to speak in a harsh and shrill voice. The only thing we can know about where Randolph has been is just what we dream. I've also visited strange places in dreams and heard many unusual and important things about the battles beyond the Sky River. The scrolls seems unnecessary, as Carter has already rediscovered his childhood dream world and is now king of Iniqvad. Mr. Aspen, visibly irritated, stammered, "Why don't you make that crazy old man shut up? We've had enough nonsense. The problem is distribution, and now is when we start." Swami spoke for the first time in a metallic, distant voice. "Gentlemen, in this matter, there is more than you think. Mr. Aspinwell is wrong to mock the evidence of dreams, and Mr. Phillips has an incomplete view, perhaps because he hasn't dreamed enough. I've dreamed a lot. In India, we always do. Like the other Carters, you, Senior Aspinwell, are a maternal cousin and not a Carter. My own dreams and other sources of information have told me many things that you still consider obscure. For example, Randolph Carter forgot that undecipherable scroll, but it would have helped if he had taken it. I actually understood what happened to Carter after he left his car with the silver key. At sunset on October 7th, 4 years ago, Aspinwell, as expected, ended up mocking everything he had heard, but the others sat in silence. They were captives of intense interest. The smoke from the tripods increased, and the extravagant ticking of that coffin-shaped clock seemed to fall into patterns, bizarre like the dots and dashes of some telegraphic message, alien and unsolvable, coming from outer space. The Hindu leaned back, half-closed his eyes, and continued in that strangely forced yet idiomatic voice, while before his audience an image of what had happened to Randolph Carter began to float. The hills that stretch beyond Arkham City are steeped in strange magic, perhaps because of something that the ancient sorcerer of Moon, Carter, had summoned from the stars or from the deepest crypts of the earth. While fleeing Salem in 1692, he took refuge there. As soon as Randolph Carter returned to the hills, he realized he was near the gates that only a few bold, reckless, and despised men had managed to open. Beyond the massive walls dividing the world from the absolute outside, he felt that today, on this date, he could finally apply the message he had deciphered months ago. Hidden in the arabesque of that moldy and incredibly old silver key, he now knew he had to turn it and how to lift it over the rays of the setting sun. Which syllables and ceremonial formulas should be chanted or given on the 9th and final turn? Somewhere near the transdimensional vortex in this mystical gate, it was impossible for the key to fail. And a primary function? Surely he would rest that night in the lost childhood for which he had never stopped mourning. He left the car with the key in his pocket and walked up the winding hill road in the heart of the gloomy field. He passed stone walls covered in vines, a forest of twisted branches, an abandoned orchard, a deserted farmhouse with broken windows, and nameless ruins. At twilight, when the distant towers of the Kingsport belfry glowed red, he took out the key, turned it, and chanted the necessary formulas. Only later did he realize how quickly the ritual took effect. Then, in the deepening twilight, he heard a voice from the past. Old Benja Corey, the man hired by his great-uncle Old Benja, hadn't been dead for 30 years before. When? What time was it? Where had he been? Why was it strange for Benja to call him? On October 7th, 1883, he hadn't been away from home much longer than Aunt Martha told you. What was the key in his shirt pocket? Where was the little telescope his father gave him for his 9th birthday, 2 months earlier? He hadn't found it in the attic of the house. He would have crossed the mystical pillar that his sharp eye had traced between the jagged rocks, at the rear of the inner cave behind the snake's den on the hill. Everyone associated that place with Edmund Carter, the old sorcerer. People didn't want to go through there. No one but him ever noticed or squeezed through the root-blocked fissure to the great inner black chamber where they found the gate. What evil could have etched those mortar marks into living rock? Maybe those of the old sorcerer Edmund, or maybe other beings summoned by him, acting under his command. That night, little Randolph joined his Uncle Chris and Aunt Martha at the old farmhouse with a wooden roof. The next morning, he woke up early and crossed the twisted apple orchard to the woodshed, where the mouth of the forbidden black serpent's lair hid among the grotesque and malnourished oaks. An unnamed expectation loomed over him, and he didn't even notice the loss of his handkerchief as he fumbled in his shirt pocket to see if the strange silver key was still there. He crawled through the dark hole with tense and adventurous confidence, lighting his way with matches taken from the living room. At one point, he wriggled through the root-choked fissure at the far end, and he was in the vast and unknown inner cavern, whose stone wall seemed almost like a monstrous and consciously constructed portal. In front of that dripping, damp wall, he stood in silence and awe, lighting one match after another as he stared. That protruding stone above a keystone of the imagined arch was truly a gigantic sculpted hand. He took out the silver key and did the motions and intonations he could barely recall. Something was missed. He just wanted to cross that barrier to the unimpeded land where his dreams and the abysses then met in dimensions that dissolved into the absolute. What happened then can hardly be described in words. It's full of paradoxes, contradictions, and anomalies that don't belong in life. While awake, but they fill our wildest dreams. Naturally, they're taken seriously. Then we return to our objective world, narrow and rigid, limited by the principles of three-dimensional logic. As the Hindu continued his story, he had difficulty avoiding it, what seemed even more than the notion of a man transferred over the years back to childhood. The air of extravagance, trivial and childish. Senior Aspian, with disgust, gave an apoplectic sigh and practically stopped listening. For the rite of the silver key, as practiced by Randolph Carter, in that dark, haunted grotto inside a cave, did not prove unusable. From the first gesture and syllable, an aura of strange and impressive transformation was apparent. A sensation of incalculable disturbance and confusion in time and space, but which showed no sign of what we recognize as movement and duration. Imperceptibly, things like age and location ceased to have any meaning. The previous day, Randolph Carter had miraculously leaped into an abyss of years. Now boy and man were one. Only Randolph Carter existed, with a certain stock of images that had lost all connection over hundreds of earthly years and circumstances of acquisition. Just before, there was an inner cavern with a hint of a huge arch and a giant hand carved on the far wall. Now there was no cavern, nor absence of cavern, no wall, nor absence of wall. There was only a flow of impressions or sensations, not so much visual as cerebral, in the midst of which the entity that was Randolph Carter experienced perceptions or a record of everything his mind grasped, still without any clear awareness of how he was receiving them. When all that was over, Carter knew he was not in a no region, could be mapped by Earth's geographers at no time whose date could be determined by historians, because he wasn't completely unaware of what was happening. There were hints of this in the enigmatic Pnakotic fragments, in an entire chapter of the forbidden Necronomicon by the mad Arab Abdul al-Zahed. To acquire is meaning. When they read the engravings on the silver key, a gate had been unlocked, not the final gate, of course, but the one that gave access from earthly time to that expanse of earth that lies outside of time, and from which in turn is the supreme gate or the final gate, which led dangerously to the final void that stretches beyond all lands, all universes, and all matter. There would be a guide, and a very terrible one, a guide who had been an entity of Earth millions of years before. When man was not even dreamed of, Carter remembered what the monstrous Necronomicon had vaguely and disturbingly outlined about that guide. While there are those, wrote the mad Arab, who dared to seek glimpses beyond the veil and accept him as a guide, they would have been wiser if they had avoided any relationship with him. The Book of Thoth says a single glimpse comes at a terrible price. Those who pass never return, for from the infinite vastness that transcends our world, there are forms of darkness that seize and capture. The entity that floats in deceit at night and the malevolence capable of defying the archetypal sign. The horde that watches over the secret portal of every grave and thrives on what grows from its tenants. All these horrors are inferior to him who guards the portal, who will guide. The impetuous one binds all worlds to the unnamed devourer's abyss. He is Murtawil, all in one and one in all. The one older than the scribe translates the prolonged one, the eternal, floated before Carter. Some forms he wasn't quite sure how, but they were connected to a primitive past of the earth. They reminded him of deserts, rivers, seas, and even creatures that crawled from one side to the other. But none of them had any fixed connection with each other. Not even Carter at that moment had any connection to any place, any time, or even any form. He wished to find enchanted regions from his childhood dreams, but in his mind he felt great fear and awakening thoughts of boundless audacity. He knew he would have to face the dreaded guide, who would demand terrifying, monstrous things. Suddenly, the parade of impressions seemed to reach a vague kind of stabilization. There were great masses of imposing stone, carved in strange and incomprehensible designs, and arranged according to the laws of some inverse and unknown geometry. It passed through a vague, colorless veil in confusing, contradictory ways, and it touched almost sensibly on what seemed to be a curved line of gigantic hieroglyphic pedestals, more hexagonal than the others, topped by shapes, obscure and vague. There was also another shape, which did not occupy any pedestal, but seemed to glide and float over the lower, clouded level of the floor. It wasn't permanent overall, but it included suggestions of something fleeting, remotely preceding or parallel to the human form. Although half the size of an average man, it seemed to be very much covered, like the shapes on the pedestals, with some kind of neutral colored fabric, and Carter couldn't detect any eyes through which he could look. It probably didn't need to look, since it seemed to belong to an order of beings far beyond the merely physical in organization and faculties. A moment later, Carter knew what it was, for the form spoke in his mind without a sound or language. Though the name it pronounced was feared and terrible, Randolph Carter stood firm. Using his knowledge from the Necronomicon, Carter responded in kind. And it looked very different from what the mad Arab had described. Maybe it only showed its magnitudes to those who deserved it. Then, that being told Carter that the ancients and he were waiting for him. He was welcome and had managed to unlock the first gate. He could be taken to the Supreme Gate if he wanted, but if he was afraid, he didn't have to. He might return safely, but what if he went to the Supreme Gate? But before that being could even finish the sentence, Carter said he wasn't afraid and wanted to go beyond the Supreme Gate. Upon receiving that answer, the guide seemed to make a gesture or something like that, using an arm or some kind of limb. And thanks to his knowledge of the occult, Carter, who was very close to the last gate, and the other shapes of the hexagonal pedestals became more clearly defined. Their outlines became much more like those of men, although Carter knew they couldn't be men. On their hooded heads, they wore some tall, indistinctly colored mitres, which strangely resembled those of the abominable figures carved by some now unknown sculptor. Along the living cliffs of a high and forbidden mountain in Tartary, between the two folds of their dense veils, there were long scepters whose carved knobs represented grotesque and archaic mystery. Carter guessed who they were and where they came from and whom they served, and he also guessed the price of their service. But he remained content, as this extraordinary adventure might reveal all the universe's secrets. Damnation, he thought, is just a strong word from those whose blindness makes them judge anyone who can see, even with one eye. He questioned the broad concept of those who babbled senselessly about the great ancients, as if they could awaken from their eternal dreams to unleash their wrath upon humanity. That would be so absurd. Think about it. Imagine a mammoth going crazy over a worm. Then the figures on the hexagonal pedestals greeted him. bowing with their strange carved scepters and radiating a telepathic message that he understood. "We greet you, Ancient One, and you, Randolph Carter, whose boldness has made you one of us." Carter then saw one of the pedestals that was unoccupied, and with a gesture from the Ancient One, he understood that it was reserved for him. He also saw another pedestal, a little higher than the rest, which he imagined was the throne of the guide himself. Carter sat down, either ascending or descending in some way, and noticed the guide had also sat down. Gradually, and as if through the mist, it became evident that the elder was holding something, a kind of object wrapped in the folds of a cloak, as if it served the purpose of allowing them to see it or perceive it in some equivalent sense. It was a large sphere or something similar made of a dark metal. Iridescent. When everyone could see it, a kind of sound began to emerge in a very strange rhythm, and the pillars started to follow that rhythm. At that very moment, Endu stopped his story and looked at the clock, which looked like a coffin, following a rhythm that was also unknown on Earth. He then went on to say that those shapes of the pillars, which were also moving to the rhythm of that strange music, suddenly fell onto their pillars in a kind of eternal sleep, and Carter then understood that it was an initiation ritual, and that the sleep of the great old ones was a key to the final gate. But what exactly the final gate was and how it would be crossed, Carter couldn't be sure. But a feeling of tense anticipation came over him. He was aware of having a kind of body and of holding the fateful silver key in his hand. The masses of imposing stone in front of him seemed to possess the uniformity of a wall toward the center, to which his eyes were irresistibly drawn. Then, suddenly, he felt the mental currents of the elder cease to flow. At that moment, Carter truly felt the mental and physical silence, which was extremely frightening. He was no longer hearing his guide inside his mind, and he also started to feel lost, not knowing if he was going forward, backward, up, or down. But then he heard that inner voice in his mind again, different from before. That's when he noticed something far away from him, and it looked a lot like those sparks from the grotto that he saw inside the serpent's cave, which led him to the first gate. And as he approached, he took the key, repeating the same ritual, and floated through the supreme gate. Passing through the supreme gate and looking back, Carter didn't see just one, but several gates, and some he couldn't even remember their shape. And at that moment, he felt a terrible fear, a fear much greater than any other he could even imagine. He realized he wasn't just one person, but several. At the same time, he was there, floating through the supreme gate. There was also Randolph Carter, who was on one of the previous pillars. There was also the boy Carter, who was in the serpent cave. And also that Carter who had disappeared after taking his car and having a silver key. There was an unlimited confusion of beings that he knew as well as the local manifestation. Now beyond the ultimate gate, there were Carters in settings belonging to all the known and suspected ages of Earth's history, and remotely, ages and earthly entities that transcended knowledge, suspicion, and credibility. The Carter of human and non-human forms, vertebrates and invertebrates, conscious and stupid, animal and plant. Worst of all, some Carters live far beyond an ordinary life on Earth, among galaxies, planets, and far from anything ordinary. But then, in the midst of those frightening reflections, a force of personality confronted Carter, surrounded him, and permeated him. And that, beyond being a local presence, also seemed to be a part of himself. It also enveloped him, present at all times and across all space. There was no visual image, but the sense of an entity and the horrible idea of a combination of the concepts of location, entity, and infinity. They lent a paralyzing terror. It's from something that the fragment Carter had been able to judge existed. Faced with this terrible wonder, the fragment Carter forgot the horror of destroyed individuality. It was the all-in-one and one-in-all of infinite uniform being, not merely a thing of a continuous space-time, but allied to an ultimate animating essence of unlimited breadth of all existence. He was certainly the one whom some secret cults on Earth have called Yog-Sothoth, who has been a deity, also known as the Beyond One, worshipped by Yuggoth's crustaceans, exists beyond or before everything. And the vaporous, nebulous spiral beings represent as an untranslatable sign. But in a moment of clairvoyance, the Carter fragment understood how trivial and fragmented their conceptions are. And then, the being addressed the Carter fragment through prodigious waves that hurt, burned, and thundered in a concentration of energy that struck its receiver with an almost unbearable violence. This resembled, in a supernatural rhythm, the curious swaying of the ancients and the flickering of monstrous lights in that disconcerting region, beyond the first gate. But in the midst of the greatest terror, the lesser terror diminished, for the scorching waves seemed somehow to isolate Carter, who passed through the portal of countless duplicates to restore, so to speak, a certain sense of illusion, of identity. Soon he was able to translate all that information he was receiving into familiar characters, and his sense of horror and oppression diminished, anxiety turned into pure reverence. And what once seemed blasphemous and abnormal now appeared only ineffably majestic. That's exactly what he understood. Randolph Carter, my insights on your planet's scope. The ancients sent you to me as someone who had recently returned from the small dreamlands you had lost, but with greater freedom and under greater and nobler desires and curiosities. You wished to sail through Ukrainos, Golden One, seeking the forgotten cities of Marfinkold, the Orchid Fathers, and to occupy the Tronopol of and to all matter. Now, after having passed through 2 portals, you desire higher things. You wouldn't flee an unpleasant sight for a comforting dream, like a child, but you would become a man who uncovers the deepest secrets behind all visions and dreams. What you desire is within my compassion, and I am ready to grant what I have granted. 11 years. Only for beings from your planet, 5 times for those you call men or those who look like them. I am willing to show you the final mystery, whose contemplation annihilates the weak of spirit. But before you consider the first and last secrets, you can still return through the 2 gates if you wish, since the veil remains over your eyes. The sudden interruption of those waves left Carter in a cold and frightening silence of absolute desolation. On all sides he felt an oppression of the infinite immensity of the void, but the seeker knew that the being was still there. After a moment he thought of words and cast their mental substance into the abyss. I accept and won't back down. Carter knew that the being had heard and now had poured out from that limitless mind a flood of knowledge and explanations that opened new perspectives for the seeker and prepared him for such an understanding of the cosmos as he never expected to possess. He was told how childish and limited the notion of a 3-dimensional world is, and that an infinity of directions exist beyond the known directions of up and down, front and back, right and left. He was shown the smallness and the empty filth of the petty gods of earth, with their petty and human interests and connections, their hatreds, rages, loves and vanities, their longing for praise and sacrifice, and their demands for faiths contrary to reason and nature. While most of the impressions translated into words for Carter, there were others for which other senses provided interpretation. Perhaps with his eyes or imagination, he sensed he was in a realm beyond dimensions imaginable to man. He now saw in the shadows of what was once a vortex of power and then a void, a whirlwind of creation that confused his senses. From some inconceivable point of view, he looked at prodigious forms whose multiple intentions transcended any conception of being, such limits that his mind until then had been able to maintain. Despite a lifetime of critical study, he began to vaguely understand why he could exist at the same time. Little boy, Randolph Carter, Arkham Farmhouse, 1883. The misty shape on the hexagonal pillar beyond the first gate now faced the presence in the endless abyss, and all the other Carters who perceive your imagination and your senses. Then the waves grew stronger and tried to improve his understanding. reconciling him with the multiform entity, of which his fragment was an infinite part. They told him that the entire figure of space is just the result of an intersection by a plane of some corresponding higher dimensional figure. One dimension, like a square, is cut from a cube, or a circle from a sphere. The cube and the sphere of 3 dimensions are thus cut from corresponding 4-dimensional shapes, which men know only through dreams and conjectures. And these in turn are cut from 5-dimensional shapes, and so on, up to the dizzying and infinite heights of the archetypal infinity. The world of men and the world of gods, of men. It is merely an infinite phase of an infinite thing, the 3-dimensional phase. From that small wholeness reached at the first portal, where Omir Tauyu spoke the dream of the ancients. Although men consider it reality and consider the thoughts of its origin, of many dimensions, as reality. Actually, it's the opposite. What we see as substance and reality is actually shadow and illusion, and what we see as shadow and illusion is substance and reality. Time and the waves went on. This is motionless, timeless, and what moves or changes is an illusion. In fact, it is itself an illusion, because except for the narrow view of beings in limited dimensions, there are no such things as past, present, and future. Men think of time only by what they call change, but that is also an illusion. All that was, is, and will be exists only at the same time. These revelations came with the solemnity of a God that left Carter unable to doubt. Although they almost completely escaped his understanding, he felt that they must be the true light of cosmic reality, ultimate, which disproves all local perspectives and narrow partial views. He was familiar enough with deep speculations, for he was free from the bondage of local and partial conception. His search had not been based on faith in the reality of the local and partial. After an impressive pause, the waves continued, saying that what the inhabitants of small-scale zones call change is merely a function of their consciousness, which sees the external world from various cosmic angles, just as the shapes produced by cutting a cone seem to vary, with the angle of the cut being a circle, ellipse, parabola, or even something else depending on the angle of the cut. But without any change in the cone itself, the same happens with the local aspects of something unchanged. Infinite reality seems to change with the relative cosmic angle. For this variety of angles of consciousness, the weak beings of the lower world are slaves, because, with rare exceptions, they cannot learn to master them. Only a few students of forbidden things have gained hints of this control, and with it have conquered time and change. But the entities outside the gates command all the angles and can contemplate, at will, the myriad distinct facets of the cosmos, in terms of the fragmentary perspective of change, or the immutable totality, beyond perspective according to their will. The waves fell silent again, and Carter began to vaguely and terrifyingly understand the background. The end of that enigma of lost individuality that had so horrified him at first. His intuition pieced together the fragments of revelation and brought them ever closer to understanding the mystery. He realized that much of the terrible revelation would have shattered his ego among countless earthly counterparts. Well, inside the first portal, the magic of the One in All had not prevented him so that he could use the silver key precisely to open the last gate. Eager for clearer knowledge, he sent waves of thought asking about the exact relationship between the various facets. The fragment now, beyond the supreme portal, the fragment still on the pedestal, almost hexagonal beyond the first portal. The boy in 1983, the man, in 1928, his ancestors' primitive life forms, and the Balo, art of his ego, the nameless beings of other times and lost universes, whom that first hideous flash, in the end, revealed as himself. Slowly the waves of being arose in response, trying to make clear what was almost beyond the reach of an earthly mind. According to the waves, all the descending lines of beings from finite dimensions are in reality manifestations of an archetypal and eternal being, which exists outside the space of dimensions. Each of these creatures, whether father, son, grandfather, alien, or earthly, any of them are actually just a phase of this archetypal being. They arise through a variation in the angle of the plane of consciousness that cuts through it. A small change in that angle could lead, for example, Randolph Carter to become the evil wizard, Edmund Carter. The archetypes continued. The waves are the people of the final abyss. Ineffable reports imagined only by rare dreamers in a low-dimensional world. The main one was this informing being, actually Carter's own archetype. Carter's relentless zeal and that of all his ancestors for forbidden cosmic secrets was the result of a natural derivation from the supreme archetype. In all worlds, all the great wizards, all the great thinkers, all the great artists are facets of him. Nearly fainting with dread and a strange delight, Randolph Carter's consciousness honored the transcendent entity from which he came. When the waves fell silent again, he pondered in the magnificent silence, thinking of strange tributes, strange questions, and even greater appeals. Curious concepts flowed from the conflict through his confused mind, with unreal visions and unforeseen revelations. It occurred to him that if a revelation were literally true, he could physically visit all those infinitely distant ages and parts of the universe that until then he had only known in dreams. Could he just use the magic to alter the angle of a planar consciousness? Didn't the silver key give him that magic? It hadn't changed. First, from a man in 1928 to a boy in 1883, and then to something beyond time, the mind. Despite his apparent lack of a body, he knew that the key was still with him. In the midst of that silence, Carter sent, through his feelings, his curiosity about his facets, which were far beyond the galaxy where he lived. He also knew that this supreme entity could very well send him to one of its extraterrestrial fragments, and the entity itself, realizing this, said it would send him. But it also warned that if he wanted to return, he should take the symbols with him. Carter said he understood because he knew the silver key would be with him, and on it were marked several symbols. Suddenly, a deafening buzz sounded and bands of light appeared, and, very quickly, he saw a solitary figure sitting on a shadowy, nebulous throne, even more hexagonal than it was before. When Indu paused in his story, he noticed that Marigny and Phillips were watching him quite attentively. Meanwhile, Aspian pretended to ignore him and kept his eyes ostentatiously fixed on the paper in front of him. The ticking of the strange, coffin-shaped clock took on a new and sinister meaning as the vapors, overloaded and neglected, intertwined, creating fantastic and inexplicable silhouettes, forming disturbing combinations with the grotesque figures on the tapestries, swayed by drafts. The old man, who had been with them until then, had disappeared. Perhaps some growing tension had frightened him out of the house. An almost apologetic tension disrupted the speaker when he returned to his monologue, with his laborious and idiomatic language. Carter, after those drums and lights, realized it seemed to be one of his many dreams. He was walking among beings with claws and snouts, down a street that seemed metallic and shaped by the glow of various solar colors. Looking down, he was even more startled to see his body was like the others, rough, partially scaly, and curiously jointed in a way similar to an insect, but the overall outline was still very much like a human. He was still holding the silver key, but at that moment, what was gripping it tightly was a disgusting and sinister paw. But it didn't take long for the feeling of dreaming to disappear, and it felt much more like he was waking up. The life of Randolph Carter and the entity he eventually became. Now they were part of the dream of a wizard named Zikalba from the planet Yadit. The dreams ended up bothering him a lot because they became more and more real and interfered with his work, which was basically casting spells to keep the bulls from leaving their burrows. More and more, these dreams became real, especially because of that key in his paw, a heavy silver key that he had seen many, many times in his dreams. He thought it would be better to go to his room and rest for a while, and then look for answers. But he soon realized his body, sadly, would no longer be his alone. He would never rest as an individual again. many things happened that made Zacalba realize that Randolph Carter was taking over his body. So, desperately, he began to study humans, their gestures, customs, and even their vocal organs, which his own body wouldn't allow him to use. When Carter took over that body, it didn't take him long to realize that it wouldn't be so easy to go back to what he once was. The key he was carrying was made on Earth and could only be used by humans. There was even a spell that could give the key unlimited power, but all of that was in the scroll he left in his car. He panicked and then remembered the entity's words, telling him to make sure he was carrying all the possible symbols with him, which he thought were on the key. Carter then began to use all of Ziadit's science to try to return to the abyss of the unnameable being. Even so, it was difficult, as Zacalba sometimes regained control and tried to erase all of Carter's memories. But then he managed to come up with a plan to get off that planet. He found a drug that could keep Zacalba out for a while and still retain his memories and knowledge. And then he would use a light beam shell, never before used by anyone else on the planet, Ziadit, and travel through the ages and galactic features all the way to Earth's solar system. On Earth, he would study the scroll and try to regain his original form. And in the meantime, he also learned to bring his dreams to Earth and study places he had never reached before. He knew the dangers of his escape. If he took the planet to the right angle of eons, the planet Ziadit could end up being taken over by the Duns. He needed to immunize himself against the Ziadit bacteria, and he also needed to find a disguise for his life on Earth. Slowly, Carter's plans moved forward. He managed to make a light wave casing of exceptional hardness. He has just endured as much prodigious time transition as he has unprecedented flight through space. He checked all his calculations and sent his dreams to Earth repeatedly, bringing them as much as possible. By 1928, he had mastered suspended animation. He also found the exact bacterial agent he needed and calculated the gravitational force variation he would need to adjust to. He made a wax mask and a loose suit that allowed him to move among men as an ordinary human being. He also created a stronger spell to contain the Dolis when leaving the Black Planet, and Ziadit's death was not an inconceivable future. He also took care to gather a large supply of medicines impossible to obtain on Earth, which would keep his Zacalba aspect in suspension until he could get rid of Ziadit's body. And he didn't neglect the small stock of gold for use on Earth. On the day of his departure, he was very afraid. Upon entering his capsule and seeing he was floating in space, he left the planet without issue. And he reached Earth's atmosphere and landed near the Serpent Cave where he hid his spaceship project. He put on his disguise and his mask and walked to Arkham, where he exchanged the gold for money. He began investigating Randolph Carter's assets. That's when he found out that Aspian really wanted the distribution of his assets. And what about that meeting that was supposed to happen with Phillips and Marini? Indirectly, he managed to get a piece of the lost scroll, but unfortunately, it would take much longer than he thought to translate it. His man then finished his story by saying that Carter was alive and that he just needed a little more time to return to his human form, to prove everything he said was true. He also said that Carter and he were exchanging letters and placed the silver key on the table. Marini and Phillips were astonished because that was exactly the key they had seen so many times in photos. Aspian grew irritated and told them not to believe that nonsense, because Swami was probably a fraud and he could have just had that key made. The Hindu then replied that he had other ways to prove what he was saying was real, but those other ways could cause serious problems. Phillips then said that he had a book with several questions he could ask Swami, questions that only Carter would really know how to answer. And if they were really exchanging letters, Swami would answer the questions. Phillips and Marini get up to get the book. They hear Aspian saying that now he was sure Swami was a fraud, because he realized Hindu was masked, and he jumps on the Hindu to try to take off that mask. And Swami shouts at Aspian for him not to do that, because that's exactly what he was referring to when he said he could prove in other ways that the whole story was true, and that at that moment, he was also a fragment of Randolph Carter. Aspen removes the mask, and the only thing Marike and Philip hear is a terrible scream. And Carter's cousin falls to the ground, having some kind of seizure, until finally he stops. Luckily, Philip and Marike don't see the face that Aspen saw, because that being had its back turned to them. The figure goes toward that strange clock, and they see some kind of dark claw manipulating those hieroglyphs written on it. Manipulating. He enters the clock and disappears. A year after this probable event, 1 year passed, and nothing was heard about Randolph Carter, and his belongings remain untouched. There was a search behind Arkham for that metal casing, but nothing of the sort was ever found. However, the First National Bank of Arkham employee clearly remembers a strange man wearing a turban. He recalls exchanging an unusual number of gold bars in October 1930. But what could Marike and Philip do? Nothing could be proven or disproven. The key could really be genuine, or it could be a forgery. There were also documents that were very vague. The only thing they knew was that the autopsy revealed that Aspen had died of A. It was only the anger that caused all of this. Or was it some details of the story? And a vast hall adorned with taxis of strange figures, permeated by the vapors of Olibanum and Tiniel Arnett from Marigny. He often sits, listening, with vague sensations, to the abnormal rhythm of that coffin-shaped clock, covered with strange hieroglyphs. If you've watched the video up to this point, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video, because it took a lot of work, huh? If you want more Lovecraft Universe videos, check the playlist on the end screen. Thanks, see you, bye.